Hi, good morning, everyone. So yesterday we stopped somewhere here, I think. Right? We looked at two extreme neuron models, or two extremes of neuron models, and we saw that there's a continuum, there's a continuous axis between the two. On one end, you have this very detailed biophysical models. Other end, you have very simplistic artificial neuron models, like the McCullough-Fitch neuron model. So, is there a middle ground? What is the correct sweet spot between these two extremes? Um, So the motivation for that is the kinds of things that we do in engineering. I talked about this, the fluid mechanics as an example, right? So for this problem, going all the way to the level of molecules is not wise. So we usually take this abstraction called fluid, mathematically describe it, and then quite precisely, and that's a very effective solution. So what is the equivalent thing? What is the analogous thing in case of brain? So there is a school of thought that says that the single neuron is not the ideal functional unit of brain function. You need to look at what are called pools of neurons, a whole bunch of neurons. So if we take a whole bunch of neurons, then what does activity look like? Their average activity of all the neurons, what does it look like? So in this schematic in this slide below, you can see that yeah, you see that there's a whole bunch of neurons here. And normally, if you take a neuron and poke it with an electrode, then you get spikes. But if you take a slightly blunt electrode and just record from the neighborhood of a bunch of neurons, not from single neurons, then you will get to record some kind of an average activity of all those neurons. So that looks something like this. What you record there looks something like this. And now this signal, if you low pass filter it and high pass filter it, and that is separate out the low frequency components and the high frequency components. The high frequency components, you will see some noise and some sharp spikes. These spikes are the ones that correspond to what we call action potentials. So there's a huge, topic, right, or huge line of work, which seeks to extract the action potentials from this high pass filtered signal. Right. So that is one big problem. On the other side, if you low pass filter the signal and take low frequency components, it looks like a somewhat smoother signal. Right. This is called local field potential. Basically, it talks about the field in the locality of a bunch of neurons. Right. LFP. So the idea is describe brain function not in terms of single neural activity, whether it is rate code or spike code, both refer to single neural activity. Right. So there's a school of thought that says no, don't do that. Look at average activities of pools of neurons, right? And then model that, right? So how do you do that is a question. Now, when you model that, the LFPs is a somewhat smooth signal. You don't have spikes there, right? And if you look at brain's activity at even higher scales, LFPs, you're talking about like a few thousand or tens of thousands of neurons. But if you go to even higher scales, look at activity of the brain at the level of EEG or electroencephalogram. So to record EEG or not, you don't use the microelectrodes, you use slightly thick electrodes, which you place on the scalp of the head, right, and record. And obviously that is, so there the electrode is quite far from the tissue and records a very average activity of a large volumes of tissue. And so this has been around for almost a century now. I think it was discovered or developed sometime in the 1920s or 30s. Now, so the waves of EEG are grouped into different frequency bands, right? For example, and also depending upon the significance of these waves to certain brain function. So, for example, the delta waves refer to very small frequencies, 0.2 to 3 hertz, right? And this kind of waves are seen in deep sleep or dreamless sleep. Theta waves, 3 to 8 hertz, they're important. They have a role in many things. One is they have a role in plasticity or this modification of synapses, which happens during learning. Theta waves also are prominent in the hippocampus, right? And they are seen. They have a lot of interesting significance in encoding spatial information. So, how does a person or an animal encode the knowledge of the surrounding space? That is, the theta waves have a lot of role in that. Then alpha is a very prominent wave, widespread in the brain. It goes from 8 to 12 hertz, right? And it's found in a relaxed state. So that is, if you sit calmly with your eyes closed, you find a lot of alpha. The alpha band power increases in EEG. And beta is even higher, 12 to 30 hertz. This is found when the brain is in alert state and active. So usually, if you want to switch between alpha and beta, that is increase one and decrease other. You just open your eyes and be engaged in some mental activity, and then you will see beta going up. Or close your eyes and try to calm your mind, you will see alpha going up. So there's a very simple relationship in these two. Then gamma is even higher, 30 to 120 hertz, associated with information processing, thinking and learning. So gamma, for example, is found when you're consciously perceiving something. So let's say I perceive a moving bar, right, and the neurons that fire in response to that, right, are found to fire in synchrony in the gamma band. So in this 30 to 120 hertz, particularly conscious perception is thought to be, so the neural underpinning of conscious perception is thought to be synchronized activity of neurons around 40 hertz band. Okay, so that's a big theory, and there are also kind of counters to that, but that's a very important theory proposed by many people. One of them is Crick of Watts and Crick. Now, so I just want to quote from this paper, the science paper by Bazaki and Dragon. They say that synchronized activity of oscillating networks is now viewed as a critical middle ground, right, linking single neuron activity to behavior. So at the smallest level, you have single neuron activity, right, and at the highest level of brain function, you see what you see outside, right, in terms of behavior, moving hands, moving legs, moving eyes, things like that. So what is that middle ground which links the smallest level to the highest level? That middle ground, these people say, is networks of oscillating networks that are synchronized. All right. So that means at the unit level, then in that network is basically a bunch of nodes and edges, right? So what are the nodes in that network? Those nodes are not single neurons, but small pools of neurons, where the output is somewhat smooth, and they can ideally be or conveniently be described using oscillators, right? Nonlinear oscillators, because we have seen that even at level of single spikes, a limit cycle oscillator is better than a harmonic oscillator. So anyway, so I just want to say that just to give an idea of how a single, even if a single unit has very complicated, a bunch of units can be described using simple mathematical models. Like a simple example of that, right, is if you look at single ion channel, right, current in a single ion channel, we've seen that it looks something like this. You see these very sharp drops, and then so it's extremely chaotic and quite stochastic, single ion channel. So you have to come up with probabilistic models to describe all that. But we have described, so this is the channel conductance. When it is open, conductance is high. When it is closed, conductance is low or almost zero. So if single channel is so complicated, how are you going to mathematically describe it? So we say that no, we won't describe single channel, we'll describe populations of channels, their collective activity. And what does that look like? In case of Hodgson-Huxley model, we have seen that the sodium conductance simply looks like this. Potassium conductance looks like this. Okay, so that's a pretty smooth signal. I can easily describe a model, I can describe a curve like this using some simple mathematical expression. I don't need probabilistic. So this is a good example of, so this is a population of ion channels. Right, so at a single unit level, it can look very complicated, but a population of that, where all these complex changes cancel out, and you can get a smooth effect. So this is a good example. Similarly, at the level of single neuron, the activity can be very complex, and you have to describe it in terms of spikes and all that. But if you take a whole bunch of them and add them up, right, that activity can look much simpler and smooth. But this is a kind of intuitive approach or attitude towards use of oscillators. We have already seen models of neural oscillators. So we have, especially the ones we have seen are all like two variable models. So Wilson-Cowan we haven't discussed, but it's also a very popular model and very similar to Fujii-Nagumo, right? And so that gives you these action potentials waveforms. It also has limit cycles, but you can see the I mean, it looks slightly analogous to Fujii-Nagumo in some sense, and Hopf oscillator also in some sense, because especially the first two terms. So then Fujii-Nagumo, we have seen in this case, actually, this is a Fujii-Nagumo model extended to the spatial dimension also. So it also has a spatial propagation. So if you want to model axon propagation using Fujii-Nagumo model as action potential model, then it will look something like this. So anyway, then Morris-Licard we have seen. Van der Pol also we have seen this. We have given as an example of Lienard system, right? Now here we must make a point. That is, the models of oscillators we have seen until now, we've been using them as models of action potential, which means as models of single neural activity, right? So there's an extreme way of looking at action potential where you only care about, so where you call it a spike, and you only care about the time at which the action potential has occurred, and we don't care much about the shape of the action potential, because that's idealized spike. But in case of Fujii-Nagumo and all these oscillator models, you have some kind of a spike waveform also. It's not just the time at which spike occurs. In fact, if you ask where does spike occur, you have to say something like at the peak. Okay, it's not very clear. Now we can use the same model also to represent LFPs, because basically it's a bunch of mathematical equations which show something going up and down, so something oscillating in some periodic fashion. Right? Why can't we use the same thing even for to represent the local field potentials? Right? So this kind of slightly smoother oscillations. So that's what we will do, and we know how to define oscillator models and analyze them using phase clearing techniques. We know what limit cycle is. We know also what is the difference between. So this is a general presentation I made for general audience. So I'll skip some of these things. We've also seen the difference between the harmonic oscillator and the limit cycle oscillator. Okay. So now what we will do is, so we have seen so many different oscillator models, but we found that Hopf oscillator has some very nice mathematical conveniences. All right, so we'll review Hopf oscillator stuff a little bit, and then start presenting this new line of theory that we have developed. So Hopf oscillator equations in Cartesian coordinates look like this. We have seen that, and if you convert that into polar coordinates, it looks like, right, converted to r equal to x equal to r cos theta, y equal to r sin theta, and you get this. So basically you see that r tends to 1 and theta simply is a rotor, right? Simply goes around with a angular velocity 1, or you can even make it omega. So by sticking omega here, right, in here at this point. Right, so you have once it settles down, you have an oscillator which goes around the unit circle at angular velocity 1. We have proved all this, right? I also prove this using complex variable methods, but let us skip all that. Right. So now our objective in the long run in my lab is to rework a lot of neural network theory using oscillators. So basically, if your basic unit of basic neuron unit, right, is defined by a sigmoid neuron or something, we get a lot of theory. Right, if you might have taken some courses on artificial neural networks or AI and deep networks, you have seen feed-forward networks, self-organizing maps, autoencoders, all these things. So now, if you say that the single unit is an oscillator, right, then how do you rework all this theory in terms of oscillators? So this is what we want to do, and I strongly believe that that kind of a that body of models, right, will be able to describe brain function quite effectively. So what can you do with that? So let us start with the very first problem. That is, suppose I have an oscillator, Hopf oscillator here, shown here. I give an external input, which is also a sinusoid given by a complex sinusoid given by I naught is I naught times e power I omega naught t plus some phi. So now if the so the frequency of the external sinusoid is omega naught, and the intrinsic frequency of this oscillator is omega, right? So now so if the two frequencies are different, how can you modify the frequency, the intrinsic frequency of the oscillator, so that it comes close to the frequency of the external input. So its frequency must be adaptive. So you call such an oscillator adaptive Hopf oscillator. This was described by Rigetti et al. And so using so Rigetti et al. Used helped to model in terms of in real variables. We have done it in complex variable notation. It's slightly different. That's all, right? And it looks something like this. Derivation looks something like this. So you take the Hopf oscillator here in this equation 2a and give the external input current in the form of some I naught into e power I, etc., etc. So that if you split into real and imaginary parts, it looks something like this. Now convert this into polar coordinates. You get r dot equal to something and phi dot. Phi is the phase of the oscillator. Here phi equal to something. Phi dot is equal to something. So now, if your external input is not there, the phi dot will simply be equal to omega. Phi dot. What is phi dot? The angular velocity. Right now, if there is no external influences, the angular velocity of the oscillator will be equal to omega by definition. But if there's external input, the angular velocity becomes something else. It is either higher or lower or whatever. Now, if you're so that means how the question now is how do you change omega so that the angular velocity is is equal to that of the external input, right, or is equal to the frequency of the external input, right? So whatever is the difference that comes because of this addition of this extra term, that must be used to modulate omega. So that is done by this rule. So the extra term, right? So epsilon is a constant, positive constant. R is also positive, right? So I naught into sine omega naught t plus phi minus this psi minus phi, right? Phi is this actual phase of the oscillator. So you take the negative of that and then use that to update omega, right? So that is the adaptive Hopf oscillator rule. That's the adaptive frequency rule. So like that, okay. So first thing, so we want to construct networks of oscillators. So far what we have done is just look at a single oscillator with a single input. Now how do you adapt the oscillator or train the oscillator, that make the oscillator learn the frequency of the external input so that after that the two frequencies are in sync, right? So that we have derived a rule. What's the next step? So that rule is already there. I mean, we have just written it in complex domain form, but otherwise essentially it is already there. Now let us look at the next problem. Now let us take two oscillators and let us couple them. So the oscillators are numbered 1 and 2. So their states are Z1 and Z2. So they have a weight going from Z1 to Z2, I'll call it W12. They have weight going from Z2 to Z1, I'll call it W21. So mathematically, how do you write it? The first equation is this, plus the term coming from the other one, so W21 times the real part of Z2 and W12 real part of Z1. So basically what we are doing here is, you have two oscillators, right, and they have variables Z1 and Z2. So to split them, you have X1, Y1 variables on one side, X2, Y2 variables on the other side. So when you couple them, right, according to this equations, you couple only the real parts. The imaginary parts will remain in the background. So in fact, we haven't done this in this course so far, but I just want to point out that even if you couple a pair of Fujinagumo neurons or Morris-Lacard neurons, usually it is a voltage variable that is coupled. The second variable simply remains in the background. It is not directly used for coupling. That's a standard. That's what people normally do. And I want to show that that is not a good thing. And if you couple both variables, you will have some really nice mathematical properties. So for example, in the same equation, this W21, W12, I assume they are symmetric. That is W12 is equal to W21 and both are equal to 0.5. And the oscillators also, I assume that the two have the same frequency. Omega 1 is equal to omega 2 is equal to 5. So 5 radians per second. So then what happens is after a short transient, so in this left upper in the left panel in the upper graph, you see the oscillation of two oscillators. You see after an initial transient, the two oscillators perfectly become synchronized, right? And you can the waveforms you can overlay. This is, I think, the real variable. That's x1 and x2. They're perfectly synchronized, and the phase difference between two oscillators is initially some positive value, and it goes to 0. Okay, no matter how many times you try this with arbitrary initial phase values, it will always go to 0 phase and perfectly synchronized. So now what we will do is we take, again, the omegas are the same like before, but now the coupling strengths are now both negative. So basically each oscillator is trying to push away the other oscillator away from it as much as possible. So what happens, initially the phase is small, but slowly the two oscillators diverge and start oscillating out of phase, right? And if you look at the plot the phase difference with time, it starts from a small value, and after some time it tends towards pi, 3.141, etc. So they're gone perfectly out of sync because of this negative number. Now, even if you take other values, so 0.5 you take higher or lower and so on, you'll always get only two possible phase differences. Either it is 0 or pi. Right, and you can even prove that. I don't know if I will prove it. Yes. So let us see what happens if you have two oscillators, right, coupled like this. Now here we have seen that the coupling is only through a real number, right, and coupled. The real number, it could be positive or negative, but it's a real number, not a complex number. When you do that, if the coupling constant is positive, you have 0 phase difference. If it is negative, it has phase difference of pi. The problem now is how can you get arbitrary phase difference? I want two oscillators to have a phase difference of 37.43 degrees. How is it possible? Right, and we want to show that that is possible if you have complex coupling coefficients and not real coupling. How do we show that? So let us show that. So let us again take the two Hopf oscillator equations. Z1 dot is equal to this, and the extra term now will be, so the coupling constants now are not real, they are complex, given by a into e power I phi and a into e power minus I phi. So we now make sure that in the previous case we have made sure that the coupling constants are symmetric, same coupling in both directions. Here the two coupling constants are symmetric in the sense they are complex conjugates. So we have seen that in case of the Hermitian matrix, right? If you go from real to complex, hello.
Yeah, I had a doubt. So
Yeah.
why do we take the coupling constants to be symmetric?
Where here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So only if you take them to be symmetric, you will have a stable phase difference. Right. And the only thing is, if the symmetric, and if it is real, there are only two possibilities. Both are positive, both are negative.
Yeah.
If you have one positive, one negative, they can keep chasing each other, the two oscillations.
Yeah.
They won't stabilize. The theorem which says they will have a stable phase difference requires that there is symmetry.
Okay.
And only thing is the symmetry now when you go to the complex domain becomes something more complicated. In the sense we know that a symmetric matrix, a square symmetric matrix in the real form, when you go to complex domain, it becomes a Hermitian where symmetry is defined as A equal to A transpose, where A transpose includes conjugation. The transposition includes conjugation. So that's what we do here also. And we'll see mathematically why it is meaningful. So you have this kind of coupling, right? Coupling terms. Now let us see what happens. So convert both these equations into polar form. Ignore the R part, which R part is nothing very interesting because R simply will tend to go towards this, this mu. Okay, so and so R1 will both will tend to go towards mu. There's also an extra term, but assuming this term is small, this coefficient A, if it is small in magnitude, right, then R1 and R2 both will just tend to go towards root mu. So nothing very interesting. But what is interesting is what happens to the phases, right? So if you look at the phase equations for first oscillator, theta 1 dot is equal to omega 1, and omega 1 omega 2 are same, right? Anyway, we'll insert that later. You get this, right? Omega theta 2 dot is equal to omega 2 plus this term. Now let us consider the dynamics of the phase difference. Phase difference psi is theta 1 minus theta 2. So psi dot is equal to theta 1 dot minus theta 2 dot, which is equal to omega 1 minus omega 2. So this is equal to 0 because we assume that these two are the same, frequencies are the same. And you get this term. Okay, so now, so this term is minus a sine psi minus phi by R1 R2 and into R1 square plus R2 square. Now R1 R2 will assume if A is small in magnitude, then R1 R2 will tend to root mu. Okay, so and so if I assume a stable phase difference, that is psi dot is equal to 0, right? Then basically we have A sine phi minus psi is equal to 0. What does that mean? So you can also do stability analysis and show that this equation will be satisfied when phi is equal to psi, or some 2 pi, and 2n pi times, you have to add that 2n pi, which is same thing, right? So basically the phase difference will tend towards the coupling angle. This phi is the coupling angle, and theta 1 minus theta 2 is the phase difference. The phase difference will stably go to the coupling angle if you follow these equations. And in these equations, we have seen this kind of math worked out only because the two coupling constants are complex conjugates. If you use same coupling constant, it won't work. So this is what we have achieved. So this is a generalized version of this result. So here we used only the real part, only the real terms, and we got only 0 and pi. But if you use complex terms, you get more general case. So in fact, you can also plug in here. So if phi is 0, right, you get a real positive value, right? And if phi is equal to pi, you get a real negative value. So therefore, these two end up as special cases of this. So if phi is 0, that means you get real positive. That means the phase difference is 0. That's what we got. And if phi is pi, you have real negative. Therefore, phase difference is pi. That's what we got here. But if phi is some arbitrary number, right, you get that arbitrary phase difference. So you're able to get a more general kind of a coupling between two oscillators. Because if two oscillators couple always with a phase difference of 0 or pi, it's very restrictive. We want to have more general kind of coupling. So that's what we're able to achieve. So even this result is not new. It is already there. People have published it before. Now I'll talk about something that we have done which is not done before. So just a numerical example, A is 0.2, phi is pi by 4. These are the omegas, right? If you if you simulate this, you get a pair of oscillators which nicely couple with the phase difference of pi by 4, because that's the value of this phi. So it works. Now, so thing is, there is something restrictive even with this case. Okay, we have gone beyond this situation by achieving arbitrary phase difference. But but we also assume this, that is omega 1 is equal to omega 2. Because if you want to talk about phase difference between two oscillators, you have to have same frequencies. Otherwise, phase difference has no meaning, right? So we have to make that assumption. But that assumption is also a bit restrictive because in the brain you have all sorts of oscillations, right, going anywhere between say 0.1 hertz to 120 hertz, right, high gamma and all that, even higher actually. So you obviously have to have a whole wide range of frequencies. You cannot have same frequency. So your theory has to be expanded further. So how can you how can you write down the equations for where oscillators have different frequencies? Okay, so now let us look at this. Let us take two half oscillators whose frequencies are different but only slightly different. That's omega 1 is equal to omega 2 plus epsilon. Epsilon is a very small positive number. So then you couple them. Okay, then what happens is, so it's I'm not proving it, but let us assume you have real coupling. So what happens is when omega 1, if omega 1 is higher than omega 2, which is what is happening in this case, then the corresponding phase theta 1 will be higher than theta 2. If the frequency difference is very small, right, then for a sufficiently strong coupling string, you can make the two oscillators come to a common frequency and oscillate. It's like people are talking, let's say people are talking two dialects of the same language, right? And let us say one guy is talking some, Awadhi Hindi, another guy is talking some Bhojpuri Hindi, and they meet and they talk. they kind of see the struggle of the other guy and throw in a few words from the other guy's dialect, come to some kind of a common dialect, and they converse more comfortably. So this is something like that. The two frequencies omega 1 omega 2 are quite slightly different, but when you couple them and use a sufficiently strong coupling strength, what actually happens is the coupled system will go to a common frequency, something in between omega 1 omega 2, right, and then oscillate at that frequency. So once there's a common frequency, then you can talk about a phase difference, and that phase difference will be such that theta 1 is greater than theta 2. Okay, so this is what happens, and you can see that happening here. You take two oscillators and you couple them. It's the thing is omega 1 is 2 here, omega 2 is 2.2, slight difference, right? And you couple them and using real coupling, right? You see that I'm using real terms here. If you do that, then you see that the initially this frequency is 2.2, this is 2, and so you keep on. So if epsilon is 0, then there's no coupling. So each fellow will be oscillating as his own or her own frequency. So there's no change in frequency at all. Now gradually increase the coupling strength. So basically, by increasing coupling strength, you are forcing the two fellows to come to a common ground, right, and come to a common frequency. So as you increase epsilon gradually, right, in fact they come closer a little bit and then diverge again, and then, but as you increase epsilon beyond a point, right, they come to a common frequency. So you can force them to come to a common frequency as you increase epsilon. Now the real problem starts when you use two oscillators with with a huge difference in frequencies. All right, or oscillators where omega 1 and omega 2 are arbitrary, and we need two positive numbers. Then the whole hell breaks loose. Dynamics gets very complicated. That is described famously by what are called the Arnold tongues. Basically, it describes the map that it refers to the map that describes what kind of phase relationships two oscillators can have. Okay, so there are two variables here, or two parameters. One is the ratio of the frequencies. This is a very general pattern. It is seen by lots of real oscillators. But the exact way the curves and all will vary from oscillator type to oscillator type. That is, if you make these plots for a Van der Pol oscillator, it will be something. For a, I don't know, for a Fujimoto oscillator, it will be slightly different, but overall pattern will be quite similar. So on the x-axis, you have the frequency ratio, omega 1 by omega 2. On the y-axis, you have the coupling strength. So what we have seen in this simple case where omega 1 omega 2 are almost the same, very close, but not the same, is that if you increase epsilon make it sufficient, if you increase the coupling strength sufficiently high, then they come to a common frequency, right? And then the phase difference is some positive, some constant value. So the coming to a common frequency is what is called synchronization. So there the oscillators are oscillating in the frequency ratio of 1:1. Okay, so now let us see what happens if you, in this map, this special case is also present in this map. How is that? The x-axis, it says, is the ratio of frequencies. Let us say the frequency ratio is 1, right? Then as you increase the coupling strength, here coupling strength is given by epsilon, you have a frequency ratio of 1:1, right? So here it is, if it is the actual frequency is 1:1, then there's no problem at all, right? But let us say frequency ratio is not 1:1, but 1:1.1. Let's say I'm somewhere here, that the ratio is 1.1. Then what this says is, up to this value of the coupling constant, I don't have synchronization, just like here, right? The frequency ratio is 1:1, right? And up to this value of epsilon, that is about 0.2, there's no synchronization. Only after that they came to common frequency. So that is seen in this part of this map. If I'm here, right, up, and if I increase coupling string, up to this value there's no synchronization. They're still beating at two different frequencies. But once I cross this threshold, suddenly the two oscillators fall in sync, and they fire in synchronization at a ratio of 1:1. Now I start with a slightly higher ratio, 1:1.4, right? Let us say, right, and then I keep on increasing. Right, this is not 1.4, it's something, but let's say you get an idea. So you go up, and now I have to use even higher coupling strength to produce synchronization. So similarly, if I start from here, I have to go even higher, even stronger coupling strength to achieve synchronization. So we have seen this pattern here also, that I'm embedding in a bigger map here. Now take other cases. Let us say my ratio is 1:2, right? The nice integral ratio of the two oscillators. Again, same thing, right? If you have only that and as increased coupling strength, because in this coupled oscillators, they love nice integral ratios of frequencies. So once you have such a ratio, they'll keep on oscillating at that integral ratio. So this is like your beat phenomena that you might have studied in in your high school chapters on sound, etc. So these coupled oscillators like this integral ratios. If the actual original frequency is integral, has an integral ratio, simple integral ratio, then that relationship will continue as you increase the coupling strength. That nothing will happen. But suppose you slightly deviate from the integral ratio, then for small coupling strengths, you don't get any synchronization. The phase will be all over the place. You won't have any stable phase difference. But if you increase the coupling strength a little bit and cross that threshold, right? After that, suddenly, so let us say this is 1.5. Let's say sorry, 1/2. That is 0.5, and now I'm operating at 0.6. At 0.6, you won't have any stable phase difference. It will be all over the place. But if I increase coupling strength, right, for a sufficiently high coupling strength, the two oscillators will come to 0.5 frequency ratio, right? And then they'll oscillate at that frequency ratio forever, and the phase differences also will be stable. So the thing is, the dynamics becomes so complicated moment you have frequencies that are quite different. Frequencies are very close, then life is somewhat simple. Frequencies are identical, that's life is extremely simple, right? And so this complex scenario is described by this famous plot from Arnold Tonks, named after Russian mathematician Arnold, V.I. Arnold. So we did a small trick, right, to get rid of this whole, and we did not know that it will work so well, but it's a small trick. It worked quite beautifully. So what we say is, look, obviously when frequencies are different, you cannot hope to have any meaningful phase difference, right? So theta 1 minus theta 2 doesn't have any meaning. But consider this. Consider something called normalized phase difference. Consider theta 1 by omega 1 minus theta 2 by omega 2. So now theta, both phases are normalized, right? And so then it will be reasonable to hope that the difference between these two normalized phases is constant. So this, if I have this between two oscillators, I'm happy, right? This is the only meaningful thing I can even hope for, right? So we'll define something called normalized phase difference, and then we will say, okay, how do I achieve this? How do I achieve a result where the psi is equal to some desired constant? Just like earlier, we were able to achieve theta 1 minus theta 2. The phase difference was able to equal a desired constant. Now what we are saying is not the phase difference, but normalized phase difference. We'll have to make it equal to a desired constant. How do you do that? The trick that we use for that is what we call power coupling, right? The intuitive idea behind that is like this. So let us say you have three oscillators. This fellow is at one frequency, this fellow is another frequency, this fellow is another frequency, right? So this is the highest frequency, this is the lowest frequency, this fellow is somewhere in middle. So when this fellow is sending a signal to this fellow, at the connection, at the synapse is now an active synapse. It's not just multiplying the signal with some constant. It is doing something radical to the signal, right? What it is doing is, it is converting this frequency into this frequency in such a way that this fellow will understand what this fellow is saying. Okay, so we have seen that if the two oscillators have the same frequency, then there's no problem. The problem comes in when the frequencies are different. So what we'll say is, the connection will be such that when it is transferring a signal from one oscillator to other oscillator, it will transform the frequency of the signal, right? So So this fellow, let us call this frequency omega 1. This is omega 2. This is omega 3. When a omega 1 sends a signal to omega 2, the frequency here, this is omega 1 frequency, but once it jumps this synapse, it becomes omega 2. So this fellow will be hearing only a signal of omega 2 frequency coming from this fellow. Similarly, the omega 3 signal, which comes from this fellow, right, once it jumps this synapse, it will get converted to omega 2, and that's what is heard by this oscillator number 2. Right, now that will be quite beautiful. So you might have heard that these days there are apps coming up where you speak into the app into your own language, and the app will translate it into somebody else's language, and it will speak it out. Right. So if you are a tourist, if you're going to some places, this kind of automatic conversion, real-time conversion, of kind of real-time translation would be quite comfortable. You don't have to learn any other new language. This is something like that. When oscillators talk to each other, each oscillator is talking in its own language, which is its frequency. The problem comes when the languages are different. Now, if the translation is happening on the line, a connecting line, the synapses, that's quite beautiful, right? So this is just a conceptual thing. Can we achieve this mathematically? So how do you transform a signal of frequency omega 1 into a signal of frequency omega 2? This is very simple. We just need to know high school mathematics to do this. Right, so if Z1 is equal to A1 into e power I omega 1t, this is first signal. This is operating at frequency omega 1. How do you convert it to omega 2? Very simple, just raise the power of Z1 to this strange power, which is omega 2 by omega 1. Omega 2 by omega 1 is a real positive number. I can always raise a complex number to a real positive power, okay, which is meaningful. So if I do that, then very simple algebra, the frequency now becomes, don't worry about the magnitude, we don't care, the magnitude is never a problem. The frequency now gets converted to omega 2. Okay, so this is a kind of magic that we do. So what does that mean? I have an oscillator at omega 1, another oscillator at omega 2. Let's say omega 1 is less than omega 2, so slow frequency is a fast frequency. This fellow sends a signal to the next fellow, and there's a coupling here. At the coupling, Z1 is converted like this. So you multiply with some coupling coefficient, the W12, but raise the power of Z1 to this. Z1 power omega 2 by omega 1. This is a signal that is sent to frequency oscillator number 2. Similarly, in the reverse direction, Z2, which is oscillating at omega 2, high frequency, when it goes via the synapse, it becomes this W12 times Z2 power omega 1 by omega 2. That's what goes here. Okay, so now both oscillators will be totally peaceful. There's no conflict at all. But each fellow will only be hearing the oscillations they can understand. There's no problem there's no communication problem. There's no language problem. Right now, can we do this? Yeah, we can very well do this. It's a very simple step. And this is what is novel. This was not done before. So all the problems of Arnold tongues and all can be beautifully resolved with this. Right. So I'll quickly go through this, but I don't think we have time. So we'll continue this in the next class. So just like before, it's very much like before. Only difference is when you couple them, instead of just a into e power I phi, right? We have a into e power I phi by omega 2. That must be the coupling constant times Z2 power omega 1 by omega 2. So we need to do that. Similarly, on the reverse side, the coupling term is a into e power I minus I phi, right? And then we have this. So you see that we are normalizing the phases by their own frequencies. Okay, so by omega 1 times Z1 power omega 2 by omega 1. Now, just like before, if you convert the both into polar form and ignore the R dynamics because it's not important, you get this. Now compute the normalized phase difference, not the original phase difference. That is psi is equal to theta 1 by omega 1 minus theta 2 omega 2. If you do that, then the psi dynamics will look like this, right? In fact, both of them will be. So now if you set this whole thing to 0, So you see that although the two terms are so different and all that, right? If you look at the sign terms here, sin omega 1 times something in the brackets. Again, sin omega here, sin omega 2 times something in the brackets. What is in the brackets is identical in both these cases. Okay, so if you set the whole thing to 0, right, you get a very simple solution, which is this argument, the stuff in the bracket should, if it is 0, then we are done. That satisfies the entire equation. So when will that become 0? When psi is equal to phi by omega 1 omega 2. Okay, so basically so there is a stable state, and we can do stability analysis to show that this is stable state. What that means is, even though the oscillators have different frequencies, arbitrarily different frequencies, no approximation, no special restrictions, and the angle here is phi, right? Then finally after coupling, the normalized phase difference, right, given by this is equal to that phi by omega 1 omega 2. So basically, we can choose your phi to be whatever you want, right? And then this pair of oscillators will oscillate in such a way that their normalized phase difference is equal to this quantity, right? So you achieved what you have achieved. Now you have a. What is surprising is nonlinear oscillator theory has been around for at least a couple of centuries, right? But this simple wacko step, I mean, at least to my knowledge, nobody has proposed this, right? But this gives you a very general set of equations. You can now couple all sorts of arbitrary oscillators, Hopf oscillators. I think it can be extended to other kind of oscillators also, but you need to rewrite the equations into complex form and all, and writing the van der Pol and all these things in complex form is slightly more tricky. Math becomes more cumbersome. So I'm not sure how simple it is. But Hopf is very convenient, right? And you can see in this numerical example. So you see that phi is chosen to be this, some random value, right? And if you run this with the power coupling equations, okay, the psi will go to exactly is 5 by 50 because omega 1 is 5, omega 2 is 10, so it will go to this value. So it will go to stable normalized phase difference. So let us stop there, and if you have any questions I can take it, because I think I've covered